Good morning, and thank you all for joining us here. I'm joined by my colleague, Minister Duclos, and very happy to be here. C'est un plaisir d'être ici avec vous aujourd'hui. Last week, I expressed my grave concerns about the impact that the unprecedented disclosure of documents contemplated in the opposition's motion would have on the government's ability to continue protecting Canadians from COVID-19. My point is that we are in the middle of negotiations for vaccines, PPE, and rapid test kits. Extensive disclosure, as contemplated, will threaten our ability to procure these goods. Over the course of the last few days, a number of Canadian and international suppliers, associations, and experts have echoed my concerns, some publicly, others privately. La première obligation de notre gouvernement doit être de protéger la santé des Canadiens et de se faire traverser notre pays à travers cette pandémie le plus rapidement possible. Tout le monde peut être d'accord avec cela. Tout le monde convient également de la nécessité de transparence et de responsabilité. The debate rests on how best to achieve this result without jeopardizing the safety of Canadians. I want to speak about two things: our disclosure and transparency to date, and the consequences of the motion if passed. First of all, our disclosure to date. Over the last months, PSPC has put in place hundreds of contracts for personal protective equipment, medical supplies, vaccines, and logistical support. We have procured approximately 2 billion items of PPE for Canadians. We have put in place 7 hard-fought agreements with vaccine suppliers. In terms of PPE, between March and July of this year alone, my department signed more than 300 contracts. This summer, PSPC posted information about most of these contracts to our website. Indeed, we disclosed in aggregate a total of nearly $6 billion worth of contracts, compiled and organized by commodity, highlighting the many Canadian suppliers with whom we have a contract. To see this extensive disclosure, please visit the PSPC homepage and click on COVID-19 contract information. Cela s'ajoute aux divulgations proactives faites par notre principal ministère client dans les contrats liés à la COVID-19, l'Agence de la santé publique du Canada. Les seuls fournisseurs qui n'ont pas été nommés sont ceux qui fournissent au Canada des respirateurs N95, des gants et des écouvillons pour les tests. Et cela en raison de la rareté de ces produits particuliers et de la fragilité particulière des chaînes d'approvisionnement qui leur sont associées. We have been releasing more information as commercial circumstances allow, and I am pleased to tell you now that supplies of gloves and swabs have stabilized to the point that this Friday, as we release the next tranche of proactive disclosures, the remaining suppliers of those commodities will be disclosed as well. When we make these disclosures, both throughout the summer and on an ongoing basis, we are demonstrating our commitment to transparency. Now I will turn to discuss the consequences of the motion if passed. If this motion passes, the ability of the government to procure and purchase PPE, vaccines, and rapid test kits will be jeopardized. Period. Both on a domestic and international level. The motion threatens our negotiations and contracts, as well as our government's top priority, which is to protect Canadians from COVID-19. I want to point now to 3 stakeholder groups who have reached out to explain their concerns with the current tabled motion. We have heard from leading vaccine suppliers with whom we are negotiating, including, but not limited to, Pfizer, Canada, that they have grave concerns with this motion and the implications for their contractual relationship with the federal government. We have heard from the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters Association that the motion, if passed, will negatively impact Canadian businesses both at home and abroad. Manufacturiers et Exportateurs du Canada poursuit en disant qu'il est préoccupé par le fait que la réputation de tous les fabricants canadiens qui ont répondu à cet appel et se sont réoutillés pour fournir à notre pays les EPI essentiels sera ternie. We have heard from Innovative Medicines Canada, which represents dozens of Canadian medicine and vaccine developers, that, quote, these companies entered into agreements on the assumption that commercially sensitive and proprietary information would remain confidential. The public disclosure of such information could have a negative impact on the very companies that are working so hard to help Canadians from the virus. In conclusion, les entreprises et les associations qui m'ont contacté, ainsi que certains de mes collègues, disent qu'ils ont également contacté les partis de l'opposition, mais que ces préoccupations sont soit rejetées, soit ignorées. Notre gouvernement a proposé de modifier davantage la motion pour apaiser ces préoccupations, mais les conservateurs ont refusé. This is not about politics. As we are in the middle of the second wave and the number of COVID cases continues to increase, this is not the time for this motion to be passed. This is not the time to threaten and weaken our relationships with our suppliers, on whom Canadians' health and safety depends. Merci. Thank you. Megwetch.
Merci. Nous allons maintenant prendre des questions des journalistes. On va commencer avec 2 questions par le téléphone, une question et une suivie, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you. Merci. Première question. Hélène Buzetti, Le Devoir, à vous.
Oui, bonjour, Madame la ministre. Donc, vous avez beaucoup parlé du secret, en fait, entourant les contrats. Mais dites-moi, qu'est-ce qui empêcherait votre gouvernement de censurer des contrats ou des documents, les informations sensibles, afin que on n'évente pas les secrets commerciaux, comme on le fait d'ailleurs dans les demandes d'accès à l'information très souvent?
Merci beaucoup pour la question. Je pense que la motion dit que c'est l'expérience de le Law Clerk of the House of Commons qui va lire les documents, qui va décider auquel document va être distribué. Et ça, c'est un point important parce que le law clerk n'ont pas l'expertise, je pense, avec les approvisionnements. Et c'est difficile pour lui de décider quel document de rédacter. Et je tourne la parole à mon collègue ici et il peut ajouter quelque chose d'autre.
Oui, merci Madame Anand, merci Anita, merci Madame Buzetti pour la question. Nous vivons dans une démocratie parlementaire. Le gouvernement doit répondre aux demandes du Parlement. Et si, comme Mme Anand le disait, cette motion passe au Parlement, eh bien, le risque, c'est que les officiers du Parlement soient obligés de dévoiler des informations qui nuiraient grandement à la capacité du gouvernement canadien de protéger la santé et la sécurité des Canadiens. Si les officiers du Parlement refusaient de mettre en place cette motion, bien, ils pourraient être accusés d'outrage au Parlement. Et ce serait un outrage au Parlement qui, malheureusement, reflèterait la difficulté que nous avons maintenant de faire comprendre aux partis de l'opposition que ces informations qui sont tellement importantes pour maintenir la confiance des entreprises privées envers le gouvernement, ce sont des informations qui sont aussi fondamentales pour protéger à nouveau la santé et la sécurité des Canadiens.
Alors, en sous-question, M. Duclos, vous semblez dire que l'outrage au Parlement est comme une option. Est-ce que j'ai bien compris que vous pourriez juste décider de ne pas répondre à la demande? Mais je voulais surtout vous demander, de manière plus générale, avez-vous un estimé du nombre de pages de documents qui seraient réclamés par une telle motion et combien d'employés approximativement ça nécessiterait pour produire ces documents? Merci.
Bien, ma réponse va être précisée par Mme Anand dans quelques instants. Mais ce dont on parle maintenant, ce n'est pas de la capacité de produire des documents, c'est du risque que la production de ces documents causerait pour la santé et la sécurité de milliers de Canadiens. Encore aujourd'hui, on a un nombre record de cas de COVID. Il y a des enjeux majeurs au Québec en particulier pour la gestion des ressources hospitalières. On vit dans une crise de pandémie et une crise économique, évidemment, mais une crise de pandémie qui va se poursuivre encore quelques semaines et quelques mois, certainement. Et on a besoin, le gouvernement canadien a besoin de non seulement continuer de pouvoir négocier des contrats avec des compagnies qui se mobilisent pour nous aider, mais aussi a besoin de pouvoir implanter les contrats déjà signés. Mme Anand a déjà signalé à quel point les exportateurs et les manufacturiers de grosses compagnies de vaccination comme Pfizer ont déjà indiqué qu'ils s'inquiétaient pour la capacité de continuer à travailler avec le gouvernement canadien si cette motion conservatrice était passée.
Thank you.
Minute.
Merci.
Je voudrais ajouter quelque chose d'autre.
Oh,
Nous
pardon.
appuyons l'étudier sur la réponse de COVID-19. Nous voulons travailler avec les conservateurs et des autres partis dans la Chambre. Mais je voudrais dire aussi, comme j'ai déjà dit, que les relations avec nos fournisseurs sont très, très importantes, surtout dans la deuxième vague. Et ça, c'est la raison pour moi d'être ici aujourd'hui. Parce que je m'inquiète parce que les contrats que nous avons déjà signés et les autres contrats que nous allons signer sont avec beaucoup de risques ici. I will say in English that there's no question that we want to work with all sides of the House in bringing a study of the COVID response forward. We have proposed that already in the House of Commons. The difficulty with the current motion, and in particular the very reason that I am here today, is because I, as Minister of Procurement, have been involved and have led the signing of hundreds of contracts for PPE, for vaccines, and for rapid test kits, for the benefit of Canadians' health and safety. And if this motion passes, it is my grave concern that those contracts are at risk. Those negotiations are at risk. And suppliers will then, as a result, be hesitant to contract with the federal government. And that chill on our supplier relationships then undermines and perhaps negates our ability to procure additional PPE, additional vaccines, and additional rapid test kits. So it's not just a question of violating existing contracts that, for example, may have confidentiality clauses in them. It's also a question of undermining current negotiations, which the House of Commons law clerk may not have knowledge of, and therefore may undermine the approach that we have been taking to our procurements, largely on behalf of the Public Health Agency of Canada for the benefit of provinces and territories and Canadians from coast to coast to coast.
Prochaine question.
Thank you. Merci. Next question, Ryan Tumulty, National Post. Line open.
Yeah, good morning, Minister. I'm wondering, if not now, when will you be able to reveal more information about these contracts and the negotiations around PPE and vaccines? Because it's an integral part of the response here, and I think it's fair for Parliament to want to examine that and understand how it worked.
Well, Ryan, thank you for the question. And I will say that we are in agreement. We believe that transparency is important. And that's why at the end of July, PSPC released information regarding $6 billion of our contracts. And we are continuing to update that information on a rolling basis, as I discussed in my remarks. So there's no question that disclosure is important. In addition, we have proposed a committee that would study the spending and the financial implications of our contracts already in the House of Commons. And that proposal made by the government House Leader was not accepted. So I want to reiterate that I too agree that it is a worthwhile endeavor for the House of Commons to study our COVID response and in particular our contracting, because that would be in the interests of Canadians, it's in the interests of transparency, and it's also in the interests of the House of Commons in terms of doing its business. But the problem that I see from a procurement standpoint alone is that we are in the middle of a second wave. We are in the middle of negotiations, and we are in the middle of our contracting. And therefore, if this motion passes, our disclosure, our relationships with our suppliers is brought into the full-fledged public eye, and our suppliers will be hesitant to do business with us. As I have explained, many stakeholders reached out over the weekend, including vaccine suppliers, to express this concern. And I do not want to be back here to explain to Canadians that because of the disclosure that we were forced to make, we were not able to secure vaccines or PPE for Canadians because our suppliers chose to walk away. That would be a highly unfortunate, if not life-threatening, announcement to have to make, and I would not want to have to do that.
Follow up, Brian?
Yeah, I'm also wondering, is there not a middle ground here that you could find with the opposition parties, perhaps providing this information in an in-camera type session? Is there no middle ground between providing no information to the committee and providing something in a different format, I guess?
Again, Ryan, I've got to take issue with your use of the words no information. As I've previously indicated, we released information relating to $6 billion worth of contracts on our website, and that information is continually updated. Having said that, by all means, we want to work with the opposition parties and come up with a solution. But what I am speaking to now is the motion that is on the table for this afternoon, and that concerns me greatly. And that is why I'm here today. That's what we're discussing, and that is of great concern to Canadians, I would think also, given the jeopardy that our contracts would be placed in if this motion passes.
We'll take a couple questions from the room.
Hi,
Mackenzie,
Mackenzie
go
Gray
ahead.
with CTV News. Mr. Duclos or Minister Anand, either one of you can have this. The opposition parties said they're going to pass this. Jagmeet Singh was the last leader to say that he was going to bring this, support the Conservative motion. So I don't see a situation where this is going to change. I know you were asked this earlier, Mr. Duclos, but just to repeat in English, is there any opportunity that the government will not bring forward any kind of documentation that you're concerned about, Ms. Anand, that could potentially hurt contracts, even if Parliament votes to have that information brought forward?
The vote hasn't yet occurred, and we're there, as Minister Anand has indicated, we're there to help focus everyone's attention on the crisis and how we can move forward with all opposition parties in making sure that what we do is always aligned towards protecting the health and safety of Canadians. That's our objective, and that's why we're here this morning. We want to inform everyone that in addition to being as transparent as we need to be, we also need to be as responsible as we have to be in this current crisis. So we, as Minister Anand has said, we have been engaged with opposition parties for the last few days on trying to see whether amendments to the motion could be accepted by the Conservatives. They have said no, we don't want an amendment to that motion. And therefore we are in front of you today to say that we have to vote on this motion this afternoon. And in doing this, the key word has to be responsibility.
Ms. Anand, you referenced letters that some of the biggest pharma companies in the world have sent. Are you seriously saying that these companies would not sell to Canada with a vaccine coming out, or any therapeutics or any other things if this comes forward? That our relationship with Pfizer, as an example, who wrote a letter this morning, it would be done if this came forward?
I am seriously saying that our contracts, vaccine, PPE, and rapid test kits are in jeopardy. And the reason why vaccine companies are reaching out to us is because they too believe that those contracts may be in jeopardy.
David?
Hi, good morning. David Thurton from CBC News. So if the health of Canadians are in jeopardy, like you say, Minister Anand, why not make this a confidence vote?
The importance of working with all sides of the House is top of mind for our government. It is the reason why we proposed amendments to the motion last week. It is the reason why the government House leader has continually said that he is open to a discussion 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The most important point, I would say, is that we need in this pandemic to work together as a government with all parties of the House and with Canadians and Canadian businesses. And that's exactly what has happened. Canadian businesses have continued to step up for the health and safety of Canadians. And so at the end of the day, we have to come forward and address the motion on the table, and we will need to make decisions about our next steps forward if this motion passes. But my point here today is from a very personal and a ministerial standpoint, not to mention a governmental standpoint, to mention that our contracts that we have worked so hard to secure for Canadians over the past number of months. And when I say that, this is working day and night, public servants across the board, putting their lives on the line for Canadians as well, are in jeopardy. And I think that is a high risk to take.
Follow-up?
Can you just outline in as much detail as possible what proposals, what amendments, what compromises have you put on the table to try and get a consensus from the opposition parties on this?
Well, one of the important proposals that we brought forward last week, which was rejected by the Conservatives, was that the vetting of the contracts be done by the PCO as opposed to the clerk of the House of Commons. And that, in my mind, is a very, very important step that would need to be taken. I would have greater assurance in that case that the issues that we are concerned about from a procurement standpoint would be taken into account. Est-ce que vous voulez ajouter quelque chose?
I think this is really well stated. I think it's an offer which is respectful of the ability of public servants to defend the integrity of the government and, more importantly, the health and safety of Canadians. I think this is something that the opposition parties will want to continue pondering while we prepare for the vote this afternoon.
OK, on va prendre deux autres questions sur le téléphone et on va retourner à la salle après. Prochaine question, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you. Merci. Prochaine question. Raymond Filion, TVA. À vous.
Merci. Bonjour, M. Duclos. Pourquoi ne pas en faire une question de confiance, comme vous l'avez fait la semaine dernière, si cette motion est si néfaste?
Mais cette motion tourne autour d'une question de responsabilité. Et la responsabilité du gouvernement canadien est tout aussi importante que la confiance des partis d'opposition dans le gouvernement canadien. Et nous avons tous à partager cette responsabilité. Tous les partis, incluant les partis d'opposition, font partie de cet effort collectif que nous avons de défendre la santé et la sécurité de tout le monde. Alors, nous sommes encore à une étape où on souhaite que tous et toutes les partis d'opposition et les Canadiens comprennent l'importance du vote de cet après-midi. Comme Mme Anand le dit, il s'agit de la capacité du gouvernement canadien de protéger les Canadiens. C'est vraiment ça qui est en jeu cet après-midi. Et on invite tout le monde au bon sens et à la responsabilité.
Suivi?
Mais tout indique que la motion va passer. Alors, si effectivement elle passe, qu'est-ce qui va se passer après? Est-ce que vous êtes prêt à aller en élection pour bloquer ça?
Bien, comme on disait, on est encore quelques heures pour continuer d'insister sur la responsabilité collective de tous les partis à la Chambre des communes de s'assurer de protéger la santé et la sécurité des Canadiens. On a confiance que les partis d'opposition vont vouloir continuer à travailler avec nous sur cette question et on va continuer à le faire jusqu'au moment du vote.
Prochaine question, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you. Merci. Prochaine question. Émilie Bergeron, Agence QMI. À vous.
Oui, bonjour. J'ai pas bien compris. La question a déjà été posée, mais j'ai pas compris votre explication. Pourquoi ce serait pas possible de divulguer des documents qui sont demandés avec cette motion-là, mais qu'ils soient caviardés, comme c'est le cas quand quelqu'un fait une demande d'accès à l'information et que les informations qui relèvent du secret commercial sont tout simplement caviardées, ces passages-là?
Mais Mme Anand va probablement vouloir préciser, mais la distinction repose sur deux choses essentiellement. Le fait qu'on soit en démocratie parlementaire et le fait que nous soyons en urgence sanitaire. Dans une démocratie parlementaire, le Parlement peut exiger tout ce qu'il veut parce que c'est le Parlement qui accorde sa confiance au gouvernement. Et par conséquent, si une motion passe à la Chambre des communes, les officiers du Parlement doivent répondre à cette motion et faire ce que la Chambre des communes exige de faire. Ceci étant dit, nous sommes dans un contexte d'urgence sanitaire où, comme la ministre Anand l'a bien expliqué, il nous faut protéger l'intégrité de nos contrats d'approvisionnement. Ça inclut évidemment l'approvisionnement en équipements de protection individuelle, l'approvisionnement en équipements médicaux et l'approvisionnement en vaccins. Et sur tous ces contrats, incluant les contrats à venir, mais aussi pour les contrats déjà existants, il faut que le gouvernement canadien puisse travailler avec confiance avec les fournisseurs. Parce que les fournisseurs, lorsqu'ils travaillent avec nous, bien, ils travaillent de bonne foi. Ils s'attendent à ce que le gouvernement travaille aussi de bonne foi pour respecter les conditions de ces ententes. Mais ils ont aussi d'autres opportunités, les fournisseurs canadiens et étrangers. Ils ont la capacité de travailler avec d'autres pays s'ils ont l'impression que leur relation de confiance avec le gouvernement canadien est minée par des processus comme ceux que l'on voit aujourd'hui. Donc, pour garantir l'intégrité de la capacité du Canada de protéger les citoyens, il faut des mécanismes qui, comme ceux auxquels a fait allusion Mme Anand, qui pourraient mener effectivement à la protection de ces renseignements par des processus de caviardage qui font le maximum en termes de transparence, mais aussi font le minimum en termes de protection de l'intégrité du gouvernement canadien.
Suivi?
Oui. Est-ce que ce serait possible, une fois que la motion, on peut s'attendre à ce qu'elle passe, est-ce que ça serait possible pour les documents qui ne peuvent pas être divulgués publiquement, parce que, comme vous dites, ça viendrait nuire à l'approvisionnement en équipements de protection individuelle, en vaccins. Est-ce que ça serait possible de fournir une forme de brefage à huis clos aux partis d'opposition qui sont sur ce comité-là, à tous les partis d'opposition?
Bien, nous sommes ouverts à toutes les discussions et toutes les options possibles, à la condition, évidemment, que ces options et ces mesures protègent les Canadiens. Et Mme Anand et d'autres membres du gouvernement ont déjà exprimé des ouvertures aux partis de l'opposition. Malheureusement, jusqu'à maintenant, le Parti conservateur a refusé d'amender et d'améliorer sa motion. Et c'est là qu'on est présentement.
On va prendre une question de la salle et on va retourner au téléphone pour une autre question.
Sure. Lee Berthium from the Canadian Press. Excuse me. How much sensitive information is really contained in these contracts? And do you really believe the law clerk is not equipped to decide what is safe to release and not?
As I said, we have signed hundreds of contracts with suppliers for vaccines, PPE, and rapid test kits. Hundreds. We've disclosed $6 billion of those contracts. The sensitive information in those contracts cannot be underestimated. There are confidentiality clauses. There are proprietary information clauses. There is information relating to the models and the makes of particular devices, for example. That's proprietary information that companies believe will be protected when they do business with a governmental entity like the Government of Canada. The reason we have been so successful in our procurements in terms of vaccines and PPE, over 2 billion items of PPE procured, for example, 7 vaccine contracts in a very short amount of time. The reason we have been so successful is because suppliers are willing to come to the table. They believe their proprietary information, their commercially sensitive information will be protected when they sign contracts with the Government of Canada. They're willing to do business with us because we are a reputable, responsible, sophisticated party. If at the end of this day, we then have to release these contracts, release the documentation relating to the negotiation of these contracts in the past and in the future, our relationships with suppliers will not only be negatively impacted, they may also disappear. Nothing compels Pfizer to come to the table and sell vaccines to Canada. They have other purchasers who are more than willing to enter into contracts with them, and other vaccine suppliers are the same. Yet we have been able to secure contractual agreements with these 7 companies, just as an example. And the question is stark. Why, in the middle of a second wave, would we jeopardize those contracts? Why?
Law clerk.
Pardon me?
I also asked about the law clerk.
What was the question?
Whether you really believe the law clerk is not capable of knowing what is safe to release and not.
So there is no circumstance in which I want to underestimate the expertise of the law clerk in his role. The point I'm trying to make is that the law clerk has not been involved in the procurements, is not a legal expert in procurement, is not aware of the negotiations that have occurred and that are ongoing, is not aware of the market conditions relating to sensitive information and commercial relationships that we need to continue to protect as we continue to battle COVID-19. That's the point I'm trying to make.
So, as my follow-up is, what can you say or do then to reassure Canadians that A, you're getting value for money, B, that companies aren't taking advantage of Canada at this unprecedented situation, unprecedented time, and C, that in light of some of the ethical challenges that your government has faced, that all of your contracts are above board?
I find the phrase value for money quite interesting. What is on the table here is the lives of Canadians. That's the end goal of our procurements. That is what we are trying to protect, the lives of Canadians. We are investing in Canadian businesses so that they can retool and ensure that we have a stable supply of domestic contracts and PPE and now vaccines. Over 40% of our PPE contracts by dollar value are with Canadian manufacturers because Canadian businesses from coast to coast to coast have stepped up in light of this health crisis. So the idea that we are not getting value for money is intriguing. The value is the protection of Canadian lives that we are ensuring occurs by providing the Public Health Agency of Canada with PPE to distribute to provinces and territories, by ensuring that vaccine suppliers will stay at the table so that we can get vaccines for Canadians, by making contracts with rapid test kit suppliers so that we can supplement our existing testing regime. These procurements did not happen overnight. They were not easy. It was an incredibly difficult summer, and we managed to come through it with these procurements for Canadians. It hurts my heart to think that they would be jeopardized if this motion passes.
Ceci met la fin de la conférence de presse. Merci.